Oh, I guess I need to connect the projector. Jesus face. I have just started the live stream. Alrighty. Projector? Hello? Oh, thank God. Oh. Okay. All right. So I'm going to restart because last time I didn't give you the slides, and I almost forgot to give you the slides again today because I forgot to hit save on Friday when I went and put them in. So we're going to talk a little bit about youth and religion and spirituality and what all of this looks like. So, I mean, if you took, I guess, sociology of religion with me in the past, this is probably going to look kind of familiar because a lot of the material is the same, a little bit more condensed, obviously, and without all of the theory attached to it. But nevertheless, it'll probably look somewhat familiar to you. Okay, so somewhere we started last time, and I was trying to rush through it, and then I realized I forgot to post the slides, so I'll go over it again. Okay, so probably the biggest trend in religious research, right, and in kind of social trends in religion is what we call disaffiliation, right? So basically people leaving religious faith, becoming what we call here nothing in particular, or religious nuns, or no religion. It really depends on who you're talking to. There's a bunch of different titles that we use for it, but it is, an unmistakable trend that's going on, amongst all peoples, right? Amongst all, like if we talk about the West, about Canada, the United States, and most of Europe, the rise of people who consider themselves nuns or no religion or nothing in particular when it comes to their religious affiliation is growing, right? And it's growing more amongst younger people than it is amongst older people. So, I mean, these are our millennials, right? And here they've got the boundaries of millennials set in a really, really funny way, which I don't like because I think it's way too late. It starts way too late and it ends way too late as well. But this is how this particular data out of the Canadian General Social Survey kind of categorizes the data, right? So you've got millennials born 1985, that's too late, should be 1980. No way am I getting tossed in with Gen X. No, just not happening. No, I'm kidding. There's nothing wrong with Gen X, and I vibe with much of what happened for Gen X. But yeah, it's way too late. And definitely I would put the end of millennials like mid-90s. I don't think it makes any sense to end it as late as 2004. When I presented this number in SOC 100, several of the people in that class are kind of in that kind of age range, right? Born early 2000s, and they're like, ew, I don't want to be a millennial. I'm like, okay, chill out, everyone. Not that great about being Gen Z, let me put it that way. Okay. Anyway, so we see, right, rates of disaffiliation in Canada, when we get into this young cohort, which we're going to say, mixes a lot of millennials and some of the older portion of what we would call Gen Z, at least for the purposes of this class, we're getting to about 50% of them saying that they are religious nuns. Now, nun is an interesting category, and the way that the Canadian General Social Survey, so this is the census data from the Government of Canada, asks the question, it basically includes everything. So we would have, no religion, I'm just gonna put no rel, atheist, oops, I'm started cursive writing for some reason, and agnostic, all together in this one category. Now there are, of course, problems with that. There is going to be, I think, significant differences between someone who says they have no religion versus people who say they're atheist and agnostic. Those are different kinds of positions. But the Canadian census, right, so the General Social Survey from the Canadian government, only offers no religion as an option, and then you can, write in atheist, agnostic as extra options. So it ends up lumping together a bunch of stuff. And if I was, to be put in charge of the Census Bureau for a day, I would immediately change this question and fix it because I hate it, but whatever. That's not me. Okay. The United States looks very similar in terms of kind of general trends. This one's not broken down by generational cohort. This is just overall population. And this comes from my buddy who doesn't know me. We've never met. I hope we do. He's really cool. Ryan Burge. Follow him on Twitter. Subscribe to his Substack. It's called Graphs About Religion. If you're into religious research like I am, so much fun to be had with a Substack called Graphs About Religion. But you see, essentially a couple of things, right? Slow declines, and obviously it's a scatter graph, right? So you have things kind of all over the place. You see a sort of high point for religion, especially evangelicals, right around here, right around 1993, for whatever reason. But the kind of general trend, and like the low point for evangelicals was about 1983. But so there's weird scatters on the graph. The general trend line for Catholics and evangelicals is they're a declining part of the population. What are called mainline Protestants, so those are your older Protestant traditions, less rock and roll music, more old hymns, and trying to, what I like to call Kirkland brand Catholics, because they're basically just like Catholics in most ways, except, discount brand. Mainline has declined, and, this is where basically the predictions began. And it's looking like it's going to decline to almost nothing by 2030. I think that's a pretty good guess. But the big kind of trend line that's risen is this purple one, right? The nuns. And basically Ryan doing some basic predictive modeling suggests that by, 2030, nothing in particular in the US Census, this isn't the US Census, the General Social Survey from NORC, from a National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago, that if the kind of current trend line continues, basically nothing in particular or no religion is going to outnumber religious people it will not outnumber them totally, but it will be the largest single kind of religious grouping in the United States by around 2030, right? So in a mere 6-ish years, if trends continue. Okay, same again. Ryan does cool work. I steal all his stuff. I mean, not all of it, but a lot of it. Just kind of general trend lines here, and this one is broken down by generation. And you can see in the US, a little bit different than Canada, right? The US remains considerably more religious than Canada does. But our millennials by 2018, basically a little bit over half, so about a third of them said they had no religion. Gen Z was a little bit lower than that, which for a few moments had people being like, well, maybe Gen Z, we're going to see a bit of a recovery for religion, but it's a single data point because this is the kind of first point where you start to see Gen Z adults showing up on the survey. You see millennials started back down here and they're up here now. So what Ryan says, and I think this is correct, as we start to get more data, we're probably going to see Gen Z moving in that direction as well, as they move out of their family homes, as there's less pressure for parents to remain religious and all of that stuff. And then Gen X, was lower again for the boomers. And the lowest was the silence, right, where it's only about 10% who are no religion. And then the greatest generation, sad, but there weren't enough of them to count in the sample after about 2010. And they were obviously the most religious, though even there, right, the kind of general trend line over time had been one of rising religious disaffiliation. So all over the place, right? Canada, the US, Europe's a whole different bag of Europeans, which I don't want to talk about because it's a whole different kind of story in Europe. And by country, it varies. Oh, I should have brought in that chart from Ryan, where he compares like European countries to US states. And it's like Utah and Poland are about the same. So Poland is still very religious, so is Utah. But then like, I think it's Virginia. No, it's not Virginia. It's one of the northern kind of colony states. Vermont. Vermont is like the same as the Czech Republic, where basically no one believes in God. So it's kind of weirdly interesting. But that's a story for a different time, I suppose. Europe's a whole different bag of cats, and I don't know what metaphor I'm going for anymore. What am I doing with this bag of cats? Drowning them? There's more than one way to skin a cat? I don't know. Let's drop the metaphor. But you see basically the whole trend when it comes to religion is one of growing disaffiliation generation on generation. And it doesn't look like anything is going to stop that anytime soon. I have squiggles from last year, which is bothering me now. I did not erase my last year squiggles. Okay. Oh, can you tell I love drawing on my slides? I have to fix this very quickly because it's going to bother me. No, keep it. Forget it. Stop. Cancel. Okay. Yeah, discard. This is how I got myself into trouble. Oh well. Never mind. Forget it. I think this is going to take too long, isn't it? I'm fine. I just have pre-selected important data. Now I can't squiggle on it anymore. Okay. All right, so this data comes from Pew Research Center, which I already circled, but I'm going to circle it again. So Pew Research Center is a big public opinion polling firm, and Pew Research has done a ton of work on religion as well. And one of the kind of things to note, this data came out of 2019, and it had a provocative headline suggesting, religion in America is over. But I think interestingly, one of the things that the kind of most recent Pew information brought out was that we've seen, again, big generational shifts in terms of kind of religious identity and religiosity. Even like if we take a couple of measures, dropped. Religious identity, right? So these are the percentages identifying as religious, right? Either, non-Christian, Christian, non-Christian, or unaffiliated. And you basically see, right, a general downward trend in people affiliating as Christian. With only minor increases in other religions. So we can't say it's because of immigration. That doesn't seem entirely likely, given how small that gain, and it's like we have a lot of people who are Hindu and Muslim moving, and so the percentage of Christians is going to decline. I mean, the percentage of people identifying as other religion has only risen marginally, right? 5%, through the generation. So it's not a huge difference. But we've seen, right, if we go back to the silence, 84% of them said they were Christian, 76 for the boomers, 67 for Gen X, and then millennials is 49%. And probably when we get to Gen Z, when they show up in the next wave of the Pew data, it's going to drop below 50, below that even, right? So, I mean, technically speaking, if we look at people who consider themselves religious, it's still 58% of millennials, right? If you take Christian and other religion, so, a hearty 58, barely a majority. But this growing kind of, cohort of 40% unaffiliated people, growing really quickly. And generation on generation, right, it seems to be getting that snowball or exponential kind of growth to it. In terms of behaviors, right, religious behaviors, we see a similar kind of pattern, right, with the silent generation. Basically, if we go several times a month, right, once a month or more in terms of religious adherence, for the silent generation, it's about 60%. By the time you get down to millennials, right, you're talking about 35%, so just over a third attending religious services at least once a month or more. So huge declines there, generation on generation. Okay. So I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of research. I'm going to give you some different kind of models or some different kind of theories of what religious identity looks like when it comes to, actually, do I have a question slide? Is this one of those where I completely forgot to put in question slides? I totally did. But thankfully no one has any questions. I will fix that at some point. Okay, so I want to talk about some research that's been done on religious identity for both millennials, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Gen Z at the end, because there's some really interesting research coming out on Gen Z and what they actually believe. So we will get into this here. All right, so probably the biggest study of millennial kind of religious identity when they were teenagers, right? So when they were teens and emerging adults came from you'll recognize Christian's name because I talked about Christian Smith at the beginning of the course when we talked about some of the data on who are the millennials. Same study, the National Study of Youth and Religion, that was run. Basically, most of the first 3 waves of the project ran from 2001 to 2015. And Christian and his grad students are still feasting on the data. He puts out books like just about 1 every 2 years on some of the data from it. So basically ran 3 surveys. The first one being just over 3,000 people, and then they had significant attrition of their sample. Like they went back, so it's longitudinal, and they followed the same people and tried to find them again to resurvey them and re-interview them. Now it's 4 waves that have been done, trying to follow them as they move through the life course and looking at their religious development. So basically, it started about a little over 3,000 surveys. The first wave had both teenagers and their parents being surveyed. The subsequent waves was just about the kind of emerging adults and then young adults as they kind of moved through into adulthood. So second wave and third wave, they lost significant numbers of people. By the third wave, they were down to about 2,100 people. They'd lost, a little, not quite 1,000, but nearly 1,000 people out of the sample. Just people moving around, dying, losing contact, no forwarding information, and all of that fun stuff. So, so 3,000 interviews, and each wave they've done about 300 interviews. So a pretty significant research project. And it's been a pretty massive one, and probably the most in-depth kind of attempt to understand what's going on with young people and religion in a kind of longitudinal, comprehensive way ever done anywhere. Okay. Most other studies are just cohort studies, right? So all the Pew Research stuff is just a snapshot cohort study where it's like, okay, we surveyed people in a random group of people in 2012, and then we sampled another random group of people in 2019, and we're comparing the results, but it's not the same people. This one, they tried to stay with the same people, so it's a longitudinal and I think much better design, but obviously much harder. Okay, so the survey in National Study of Youth and Religion, asked questions about a whole bunch of stuff, religious attitudes, life patterns, and all sorts of things. And we'll talk about why that's important a little bit later. The first book, but definitely not the last, I think at my last count, there's been over 40 books published off the data from the National Study of Youth and Religion. But the first one was Soul Searching. And in a lot of ways, it has set up, the kind of theoretical framework for a lot of what has followed. And especially a particular idea, which is what Smith and his collaborator at the time, who was his grad student, Melinda Lundquist Denton, said was the basic motif of youth religion amongst millennials, which was what they called moralistic therapeutic deism. So basically what they said, most American youth were not Orthodox Christians, Orthodox meaning like believing in the traditional beliefs, but in fact what they called moralistic therapeutic deists. And a cartoonist, I can't remember what his name is, he eventually founded a Christian satirical site called the Babylon Bee, but I forget, his name's Adam something, but I can't remember off the top of my head. And he drew a cartoon depicting what the god of moralistic therapeutic deism is, right? Hello there, you rang. How can I make you feel better right now? How can I serve you? Wow, you're looking nice today. You're the greatest thing ever, aren't you? Man, I'm lucky to be your god. Okay, so moralistic therapeutic deism. What is it basically? Now, what Smith and Denton will say is that no teenager ever was like, I think in terms of my religious belief, I would consider myself a moralistic therapeutic deist. That's obviously not terms that teenagers know. But what they did is basically they gathered things that people were saying, they coded the data, they categorized it, and basically they said, based on what we found, this is the basic belief set of what we think most teenagers actually believe about religion. And I think if if you've been around kind of young people, quasi-religious people, even people who consider themselves fairly religious, some of this will resonate, right? I can certainly think of a lot of people I know that probably fit this kind of pattern. Okay, so point number one, right? Belief number one in moralistic therapeutic deism: there is a God, creates, he creates and orders the world and watches over human life. Okay, pretty easy. God wants you to be good and nice and fair to each other as taught in the Bible. And I'm going to highlight this because actually this is really important. It ends up being really important. In the Bible and most world religions. So all religions are kind of the same, right? What's the central purpose of life according to moralistic therapeutic deism? So what most people believe religiously, it's to be happy and feel good about yourself. This God doesn't need, hey, let's highlight that too. Doesn't need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when you need God to resolve a problem. And of course, good people go to heaven when they die. This, in lots of ways, is kind of my favorite one, because in the research, and Smith does a really good job of summing this up in multiple books, right? And my favorite one is John. I don't know why. John is always stuck in my head because they interviewed him in Wave 1 and he shows up in Soul Searching. They interviewed him again and they quoted some of his interviews in one of I think it's in Souls in Transition, which is this part of the second wave kind of data. And John is 100% a terrible person. Self-described as he uses women, sexually with no intention of treating them well, fights with his father. He and his father took a random gambling trip to Las Vegas and they got into a fist fight over blackjack. And yet when questioned about his religious beliefs, John is like, well, good people go to heaven when they die and I'm basically a good person. And I wanted to hit my head against a wall and be like, no, you're really not. But good people is construed in such a broad way by most young people that it's like, well, I'm not Hitler. And anything kind of short of Hitler or I haven't murdered anyone is a good person. So basically, it's a sort of universalist belief in heaven, right? Almost everybody goes to heaven except for Stalin, Hitler, and people who murder people. Okay, I'm going to play you a little clip. I forgot I had a clip here. Make sure the audio is on. It is.
The majority of American teenagers, I think, are moralistic therapeutic deists, not Catholic, not Presbyterian, not Jewish. The God of moralistic therapeutic deism, I say in the book, is something like a combination of a divine butler and cosmic.
This is Christian Smith. He's freaking brilliant. Just wanted to point that out. Love
therapist. He takes care of your problems, he helps you to work out your difficulties, and doesn't get too personally involved in the meanwhile. Moralistic therapeutic deism basically believes, sure, a God exists, it's theistic, God created the world, God orders the world morally, people should be nice and fair and friendly, that the purpose of life is to be happy, to be satisfied, that's what it's really about, that God doesn't need to be very involved in one's life, God can sort of be off at a distance, hence the deism, except when one gets into trouble or has problems or needs something solved, then one can call on God and God will sort of hop to it. And teens have an immense amount of faith that God solves their problems. He fixes their troubles and he makes life work better. He makes them happier. Religious traditions are, from my perspective, are really being colonized and corroded from the inside out by moralistic therapeutic deism. And that is, as a sociologist, I am skeptical of what is going to be the fiber or the theological content or the intellectual substance of beliefs and practices of people a generation hence. It seems to me that many social forces are basically converging to sort of water down religious faith of all different sorts, so that you no longer have distinctively Catholic and Jewish and Muslim and Wesleyan or whatever. You just have this sort of bland mush of be nice, call on God when you need him. And that is not what these religious traditions really believe. I've come to think that in our culture, increasingly, the language of faith is like a second language. It's like Spanish or French or German. It's not a primary language that people learn and speak. And we know about second languages that you don't just pick it up by osmosis. You need to be around people that speak it. You need to be instructed in it. You need to have practice talking in it. And I think one of the things that was clear in what we found is that very few adolescents are having much practice learning to speak their second language of faith.
Okay, I love that metaphor. It's a metaphor that I find really resonates. Interestingly for me, this idea of faith as a second language and one that's being kind of lost, as it's being colonized and kind of pushed out by, I would say, pop culture and other things that take up the attention. People aren't practicing religious language, and so they don't get religious ideas. Okay, what does a pop culture idea of this look like, by the way, of moralistic therapeutic deism? I think you see it show up in this show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to your first day in the afterlife. You were all, simply put, good people. But how do we know that you were good? How are we sure? During your time on Earth, every one of your actions had a positive or a negative value, depending on how much good or bad that action put into the universe. Every sandwich you ate, every time you bought a magazine, every single thing you did had an effect that rippled out over time and ultimately created some amount of good or bad. You know how some people pull into the breakdown lane when there's traffic and they think to themselves, who cares? No one's watching. We were watching. Surprise! Anyway, when your time on Earth has ended, we calculate the total value of your life using our perfectly accurate measuring system. Only the people with the very highest scores, the true cream of the crop, get to come here, to the good place. What happens to everyone else, you ask? Don't worry about it. The point is, you are here because you lived one of the very best lives.
What? Gave out full-sized Halloween candy bars at Halloween. I love that one. What are some of the other ones? Began to compose social media posts about David Bowie dying, then thought, the world doesn't need to hear my thoughts on David Bowie. Anyway, I think it's funny, right? And again, it sort of frames it. I know this one has installed solar panels. I know it sort of frames it in a way, there's good people, bad people. So it doesn't quite fit moralistic therapeutic deism, but the whole idea being like, okay, the point of life is to be good, nice, and happy, right? That's the MTD part. My soundtrack is back. Okay, so moralistic therapeutic deism, right? As Smith and Denton sort of say, right, teenagers don't use this term. It's not actually a term that anyone talks about other than academics like me, because we're big nerds. But what Smith and Denton say is they use it to summarize teens' attitudes. Okay, so there's three aspects to it, obviously, right? It's moralistic, it's therapeutic, and it's deistic. I'm going to break each of those down in terms of what they mean. All right. I don't know why that's so amusing to me. So MTD is about inculcating a moralistic approach to life. What does that mean? So it basically means that central to living life is being a good person, right? A good and moral person. So it has a definite moral aspect to it, right? And moralistic therapeutic deism is moralizing, right? It separates good actions from bad actions, has a very clear script of what it means to be a good or bad person. And the goal is living a good and happy life and being a good person. So what does this look like? Okay, highlighter time. It means being nice, kind, pleasant, respectful, and responsible. Okay? So you should be nice, you should be kind, you should be pleasant, respectful, and responsible. So all things, that's what a good person looks like. Working on self-improvement and taking care of your health. And here's one, I love this. I love it so much. Why? Because, I tend to think of these two as being very neoliberal, right? You can think of it in terms of like Foucault's idea of biopolitics, right? That part of the way that populations get shaped in late modernity is so that they're assets to the state, right? So that they're assets to the powerful. And one of the ways you do that is by working on self-improvement, right? So that you're a useful person, right? And taking care of your health so that you're ready to jump in. You can work a long time. You're not a burden on the healthcare system and all of those things, right? So I find these 2 points very capitalistic, very neoliberal. But this is part of the script, right? You should work on self-improvement. You should try to be a better person, and you should take care of your health, right? So hit the gym and all that jazz. And doing your best to be successful. Again, this is a kind of where maybe American capitalism, neoliberalism merges with a sort of religious ideal. Right? You should try to be successful, right? You want to do well in life, and that means usually getting an education and a job. Okay, yeah, so you should be, what does being moral look like? It should be, being the kind of person other people will like and fulfilling your personal potential. There's that neoliberalism again. Not being socially disruptive or interpersonally obnoxious. So this is a really, really kind way and a really diplomatic way of phrasing what Smith and Denton said was the typical phrase that people used, which was, don't be an asshole, right? They said in interview after interview after interview, basically people said being a good person is in large part about not being an asshole. So that was, part of the moral vision of MTD. Okay, and this I think is really important, and we'll come to this, we'll talk about Kendra Cresty Dean, who worked on this project as well, that this moral vision, right, is inclusive of most religions. So basically people think this is true of all religions. All religions sort of share this value. And basically most teenagers at this point, and this as they moved into emerging adulthood, right, they maintain this vision. Melinda Lundquist Denton has written a follow-up book, I think just came out 2 years ago, called Back Pocket God, about how religion interacts with the smartphone era. And which she sort of admits that, MTD, she calls it MTD 2.0, is alive and well amongst Gen Z as well. So, they played that piano so loud. I mean, very talented, obviously. So yeah, basically all religious visions in this view are morally equivalent, right? They all are basically teaching the same thing. It's the sort of, I guess, you don't want to get too deep into philosophy, but if you want to, this is the sort of Kantian idea, right? So from Immanuel Kant, that all religions are, in a sense, the different paths up the same mountain, and that essentially religion is equivalent to ethics, right? So it's a very Kantian ideal. Okay, so key to this vision too is the next part, feeling good about yourself, is an essential aspect to living a moral life. So you need to feel good about yourself, which brings us to the second idea. God, I'm so consistent. I was thinking about Philip Reef just now. The second aspect of it, which is that MTD is also about providing therapeutic benefits, right? So if we're into MTD, we now got the M, and we're working on the T. This is T. So MTD is also about a therapeutic benefit. So why do I have Philip Reef written here? So Philip Reef, back in the 1960s, he's a psychologist. He wrote a book, and it's the only time you'll ever hear me say anything nice about a psychologist. Philip Reef wrote a book, a really interesting one, called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And I mean, basically what Reef talked about was that in the kind of post-Freud era, that ultimately we were moving into an era where the therapeutic and the idea of therapy as the dominant metaphor for the West had essentially taken over. And one of the things that he predicted in The Triumph of the Therapeutic is that religion would eventually come to serve a therapeutic purpose as well, right? That religion itself, if it was going to survive in the post-Freud era, had to be about making you feel good about yourself. And according to Smith and Denton, this is precisely what teenagers think religion is for. And therefore, if it's not doing that, then it's not working. Okay, so this is right from the book. Sorry, I should put the page numbers. This is a quote. So it's not, I didn't say this, I'm not this clever. Right, so MTD is not a religion of repentance from sin. Right, so that'd be a very traditional Christian belief, repenting from sin. Keeping the Sabbath, right, a very traditional Jewish belief. Of living as the servant of a sovereign divine, right? It's not a religion that stresses any of these things. Of steadfastly saying your prayers, of faithfully observing high holy days, of building character through suffering, basking in God's love and grace, or spending yourself in gratitude and love on causes of social justice. None of that, right? MTD is not about any of that stuff. The actual dominant religion amongst US teenagers is about, highlighter time, friends. I know you love I picked the eraser. Feeling good, happy, and secure and at peace. That's what we think of religion as being for. Not any of this stuff. I mean, outside of a few, probably religious specialists, most people don't conceive, religion in this way. Certainly not amongst millennials. It's about this. So it's about gaining subjective well-being and being able to resolve problems and getting, again, being friendly, nice, and kind, getting along well with people. So it helps you deal with your stuff so you can be good, nice, helpful, and productive and all that jazz. Okay, so that was someone just laugh at who's awesome, you're awesome? I don't know. Okay. All right. I love Buddy Jesus. That's from the film Dogma. The Kevin Smith film is the Buddy Jesus statue. All right, so we've got MTD. That's M, right? It's moralistic, it's therapeutic. Now we are working on the deistic aspect. Okay, so what does this look like? Let's go back to highlighter. So, the music's getting more upbeat as we go forward. All right, so MTD is about a belief in a particular kind of God, right? So basically what Smith and Denton said is that this is a God, right, not one who's particularly personally involved in our affairs, right? So this is a God that's just sort of hanging out, not too worried about your life, especially when you would not want to have God involved, right? All good. Right, there's no real rules around things like sexuality, behavior. God's not really worried about any of those things, right? Anything that we think of as the futzy kind of moralistic rules of older forms of religion, right? The God of MTD is not worried about any of those things, just wants you to be awesome. Right, so most of the time, God keeps a safe distance. Teens described him as watching over everything from above, right? Sort of controlling things, but sort of not. And usually only involved in people's lives when they call upon him, which is usually when they have some kind of trouble, problem, or bad feeling they want resolved. I had this friend when I was in university, right? Not a religious person in any sense of the word, but when he thought he got his girlfriend pregnant, you've never seen a more religious person, right? Praying to God that she was not in fact pregnant, which turned out she wasn't. Honestly, I've never seen someone turn religious so quickly as when he thought he got his girlfriend pregnant. So, like, please, God, please, I'm not ready. Anyway, oh, my dear friend. Anyway, so he's still a terrible person, by the way. Anyway, and I was just smiling at his misery, because I like Schadenfreude. I like reveling in the pain and suffering of others. All right. So what was I saying? Right. Only when there's some problem you need dealt with do people actually think that, okay, now I can get this deity involved. And so what Smith and Denton say, right, is this is a revision of the classical idea from the 18th century of deism, which was, God made the universe and then buggered off, never to be seen again. In this one, right, because it's therapeutic, God is there to be a therapist when you need them, right? But the rest of the time, not really there. And this one, I've already circled it from last year because I forgot to clean up my slides. Very important, right? This God is not demanding. This God is not demanding. He can't be, since his job is to solve our problems and make us feel good. So you can't have any of this stuff, right? Any of that stuff that I X'd off. You can't have any of that from a therapeutic deity because that wouldn't make you feel very good. Now, would it? Okay. Oh, all right. So, last kind of thing on MTD, I think. Oh, almost last thing for the moment. All right. So moralistic therapeutic deism is not, again, a religion that people adopt wholesale. Smith and Denton describe it fundamentally as parasitic, right? So what's happened is that this belief system, which probably sort of emerges out of the pluralism of the mid-20th century, the breakdown of sort of ethnic enclaves at the end of the Second World War, people moving out to the suburbs and suddenly mixing with people who were very different than them, right? Like in the middle part of the 20th century, especially in US cities, but it's true in Canada, right? Catholics were over here, Protestants were over here. You lived in different parts of the city. You sort of frequented, in a lot of cases, different institutions, and you kind of kept to your own in lots of ways. I mean, I was going to say very famously, except it's not, because it involves an anecdote from my mom. When she was a kid, right, and so she grew up in the 50s and 60s, her mom up in northern Alberta was friends with a woman who was Protestant. My grandmother was extremely Catholic. And what happened was this woman passed away. It was not permitted for Catholics to attend a Protestant church under any circumstances. So she asked the bishop for permission to attend her friend's funeral and was turned down, right? Basically, the bishop said, no, you cannot attend your friend's funeral. This is the kind of world that people lived in the past. MTD sort of emerges from the breakdown of that world, right? Basically, people start to mix with each other and they start to like each other, right? You start to have neighbors who are Protestants and non-religious. And so you start to break down some of those boundaries, right? And this creed of moralistic therapeutic deism, which says we're all kind of the same, we all kind of believe the same things, and religion's really just about making you a nice and kind person, right? You get some of those Freudian therapeutic aspects that mix in, and you get this sort of quasi-religious creed. And what Smith and Denton say is that then sort of attaches itself to religious traditions and starts to mutate them from the inside. So they start out as these very distinctive kind of belief systems with distinctive rules and distinctive character, and MTD sort of breaks them down slowly over time and transforms Catholicism, Protestantism, Islam, Mormonism, Hinduism, Judaism into kind of versions of itself so that everybody ends up sort of believing the same thing, but not what you would traditionally call orthodox forms of any of these religions. Right now, I mean, Smith and Denton will say it's a pretty bare bones creed, and it couldn't survive on its own. It has to sort of attach itself to existing religious creeds in order to survive, right? So like any parasite, parasites can't survive on their own. They need a host, and the hosts are the traditional religions, right? So now, mostly today, what we see are not Christians in the traditional sense, would be Christian moralistic therapeutic deists. Same with Jews, Mormons, Catholics, and even he says there's non-religious moralistic therapeutic deists. Okay, so basically this creed has colonized most of the religions in the US. I think that's true in Canada to the extent that people are still religious. Okay, so now, is this a big break from the past? Because sometimes we have this sense that teenagers particularly are always looking to break away from the religious beliefs of their parents, right? That they are splitting off from it in some particular way. This doesn't appear to be the case when it comes to MTD, right? This seems to be a kind of religious belief that's been growing generation to generation. And one of the ways we know this is that in that first wave of the study, what Smith and Denton found was remarkable consistency between the beliefs of people's parents and their children, right? So basically, teenagers mostly believe sort of the same thing as their parents do, and it seems to be pretty consistent. Very dramatic music. Okay, I probably have time to do this just really quickly. All right, so Kenda Cressy Dean. Kenda Cressy Dean wrote this book, Almost Christian, What the Faith of Our Teenagers is Telling the American Church. It's now, 15 years old. So it's getting on there in years, but I think it's really interesting. Dramatic time. All right, so MTD, basically. So she was part of the project. She did some of the interviews in the New Jersey area. She's a scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary and a Methodist youth pastor. All right, so what does Kenda Cressy Dean say? One of the things she suggests is that moralistic therapeutic deism is part of an adaptive process in American society. And she suggests that probably means it's not going anywhere. So basically, one person told her, it's a way the church survives in American society by equipping people to be happy enough. What does that mean, right? In a world where the choice is between a therapeutic culture and a religion that's highly demanding, what happens is religion changes, right? Religion becomes about making people happy enough. It takes on those therapeutic aspects because that's where the culture is heading, right? So the religion sort of adapts with the culture. Okay. So it turns God into an instrumental tool, right? It has that deistic element, so God becomes just sort of a tool in your toolbox for being happy, right? Which makes sense in a pluralistic culture. And very importantly, and I will end with this, but it's a really important and major point, so I'm going to switch back to my pen. For religion, now my pen is white and I can't write on my slide. For religion to survive in this culture, she says, and I love this quote. I wish I could come up with quotes that are this good. Social survival in this culture requires turning down the heat on Jesus and other confessional particularities. And I love turning down the heat on Jesus. I don't know why. It makes me laugh. It's a great metaphor. While highlighting personal communal benefits that make anxious people feel safe and valued. Okay, so why do you have to turn down the heat on Jesus? And what does that mean? It basically means, right, in your kind of, so this is a function of pluralism, right? In a society that is more pluralistic, you're going to know people that aren't religious, that are from other religions. And so what ends up happening is, in order for you all to get along, if you're all trying to convert each other all the time, it's going to be very awkward. So instead, what MTD has allowed in American culture is basically for people to stress the commonalities, right? We're all just trying to be good, nice people. That's what all religions teach. Jesus taught it, Muhammad taught it, Buddha taught it. I swear to God, I was editing a textbook, and the chapter on religion said, and this was from like a pretty decent scholar, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity all essentially teach the same thing, which is to be kind to people. And I wrote a big giant note, which was like, what the fuck are you talking about? These religions could not be more different in their moral visions, right? Like, they're absolutely not the same fucking thing. I'm sorry. It was an absolutely ridiculous statement from a scholar who should have known better. Anyway, when I put that note in, I believe her answer was, you're right, I would have looked really foolish putting this in. I'm like, yeah, you think? But, I mean, it's been in 8 editions of that particular textbook. So, it clearly had slipped by for a while. But yeah, I know I'm out of time, but I'll say this one last thing. I'll come back, maybe I'll start on this point on Wednesday. Turning down the particular religious convictions is about helping people get along without worrying about converting each other. If we all basically believe the same things, we're just different religions, then we can all get along without any stress. All right, that's it. I'm done. And I'm sorry for swearing. That made me very angry. Okay. All right. Discard my doodles. I'll go through and clean this up tonight. All righty, folks. I went 1 minute over. All right. Microphone is charging.